So I'm just going to start, and the way that this works is I have 10 questions, and hopefully they're good questions. and Clayton's going to...
Can they cut in and interrupt us if they like? I would like for that to be possible.
Okay, sure, yeah. This is, we're making this up as we go along. This is our first run. We're trying it out.
Okay.
Thank you for helping.
Okay.
Yeah, and so this will be archivally important at one point in the future. Okay, so the first question is, Clayton, what does it mean to make a poem?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know, because when I start in on a poem, I start with an interest in something or an agitation, and I often don't know any more about the poem than the first phrase or the first line. And so in that sense, my work seems to generate itself. In other words, line 1 generates line 2, lines 1 and 2 generate lines 3, because I'm looking, as it were, for where the poem itself wants to go. And if I think of some sort of fine last line, I don't hold it off for the last line. I put it in as the next line, because I don't want that kind of anticipational grid to be involved in the composition. So in that sense, I don't know what it means to make a poem unless I give you a more general answer and say that it's a profoundly satisfying experience when it seems to work. I revise a tremendous amount. I find that Allen Ginsberg's first thought, best thought, which someone says came from Blake, but I've never found it in Blake. I think it's a dangerous motto. I think it's extremely suspect advice, especially to give a young poet, because it often takes a long time to think through what a particular poem will set up as its project. And the first thoughts occasionally can be very good, especially if you're writing all the time and you're oiled and ready to go. But at times, I've had poems that I've worked on for several years before I've gotten them right. And I think that first thought is something that actually can continue through the poem. So it's not just like a spontaneous image that one gets and then that's it. So, anyway. Yes?
Is a poem ever finished being revised?
Pardon?
Is a poem ever finished being revised?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. After poems come out in books, I don't do anything with them.
Do you wish you had? Ever?
Sometimes. Sometimes. I have a recent poem. Your question's interesting for me in this respect, that I spent several months writing a poem called An Anatomy of the Night. It's 35 pages. And at several points I go back into poems that are published and I take sections out of the poems, I edit the sections, and that becomes a part of an anatomy of the night. And I figured that's fair to do, because the material is yielding now in a different context. And it doesn't mean that I eliminate the earlier poem, it just means that I've made use of it in a different way.
Yeah, Auden, of course, went back and changed a lot of his politically... when his politics changed, he went back and changed a lot of his earlier, more radical work. I wonder what your...
Yeah, that's sad. I think that's sad. Aimé Césaire has done the same thing. This new Aimé Césaire collection that Jim Arnold and I have translated, again it's a co-translation, is of a book that Césaire published in 1948 called Soleil Coupé, which we translate as Solar Throat Slashed. And this was when he was a wild young surrealist and very full of himself and with tremendous confidence and boldness. And as he became more political and he became a representative to the French government, etc., he decided that he wanted to reach more people. So he, in effect, gelded Soleil Coupé in the late 50s. He cut out 31 poems of 72, severely revised another 29, and created a new book called Cadastre. And until now, the only book from this period of Césaire that's been available has been Cadastre. So Arnold and I went back to the original Sole Cuckoo and found it to be much more impressive than Cadastre, and so we've translated it. Wesleyan has just published it.
Okay, the next question is, what is the role of beauty in a poem?
God.
Tell me that you don't like the question. Or maybe to think of it this way, one thing I was thinking of was Jerome Rothenberg said that the poems don't have to be beautiful, but yet they're objects. I mean, you're creating a piece of art. So that was my thought.
Well, I mean, I guess I associate beauty with love, and in this sense, I've written a number of poems over the years about my relationship with my wife, Carol, whom I love very much. And so it would even be possible at this point to build a complete collection of maybe several hundred pages of pieces concerning Carol, and I think that's probably as close as I've gotten to beauty. I'm very concerned. I'm as concerned about ugliness as I am about beauty. I'm concerned about getting as much as I can of the reality of the world that I live in today into my writing. And when you take that position, then you're facing a tremendous amount of negation as well as affirmation. You know? I mean, Rilke is famous for saying, you know, that the point of the poem is to praise. I think that's okay to some extent, but I think that praise or affirmation, I prefer affirmation over the word praise. Affirmation has to constantly be tested. You have to sort of hold the feet of affirmation to the fires of negation and see what happens.
Yep. Great.
I realize that's not a direct answer on beauty.
No, it is actually a direct answer. These are supposed to be provocative in some ways.
So the negation then sort of acts as a shadow. The negation then acts as a sort of shadow to set the affirmation in relief, perhaps. I mean, when you say negation and ugliness, how do you craft that into the poem, which I think essentially ideally would want to...
Well, for example, I have a long poem called The Assault, which was written 1 year after 9/11. I went out immediately and started digging up material that contradicted the official version. And it turns out that really only me and Amiri Baraka, to my knowledge, took on alternative versions of 9/11. And so I have this long poem that nobody would print. It's in one of my books, Archaic Design. It's in there. And for example, the Nation said, "Oh, we've handled all of that," when I sent it to them, which was complete bullshit, because the Nation had stayed away from all theories contradicting the official story. So in other words, it was important for me at that point to make some sort of statement and try to come to terms the best I could with alternative information relative to a story, the official story, that just seemed to me to be so impossible that I couldn't live with it. And we're still waiting for the truth of 9/11 to come out. You know? There's a piece I wrote having coffee at Zingerman's a few months ago, and I had just read in the New York Review of Books some absolutely hair-raising stories of what happens to women in the eastern Congo, the way that women are raped and mistreated. Really, I mean, I won't go into it in detail, but I was so pulverized by reading this material, I couldn't get out of my mind. So as I was having my coffee and thinking, images from the reportage on Congolese rape just simply come into my morning. And it's important for me to let that happen and for that information to percolate through the poem and be part of that period. So that's, again, it's an attempt to deal with that ugliness. There's a statement at the very end of the introduction to Alchemist with One Eye on Fire that perhaps is a more articulate presentation of this. I continue to regard poetry as a form in which the realities of the spirit can be tested by critical intelligence, a form in which the blackness in the heart of man can be confronted, in which affirmation is only viable when it survives repeated immersions in negation. In short, a form that can be made responsible for all the poet knows about himself and his world.
Thank you. One thing that strikes me reading your work is the amazing sonic quality between words in the language, but also visually how it is on the page. I was wondering if you could talk about how those things interact for you, sound, how a poem sounds versus how it is on the page. And of course I'm thinking about Olson and projective verse versus some other writers that have more of a visual attention to the poem on the page as the way it looks with white space. I'm also thinking about that article that Nate Mackey wrote about how it is impossible to read the left-hand margin of a poem out loud.
What does he mean by that?
Sound and sense. Well, he's contradicting Olson's idea of projective verse, basically.
How is he doing that?
He's basically questioning the ability to read. He says there's two different poems. There's the poem that's read and the poem that's on the page. And he wants them to remain different. And that it's impossible to read it because he has that jagged left-hand margin. And he questions, how do I read a jagged left-hand margin? How do I read a straight left-hand margin? So
well,
I'm complicating the question
uses
quite a bit.
both. There's a lot of Olson's poetry that has indentations. I mean, if you just simply flip through the Maximus poems, why poem after poem has this kind of scattered. And in fact, Mackey is more conventional in terms of his alignments on the page than Olson. You're never quite sure where that next line is going to begin, how far it's going to be indented, or if it's going to drop down in the middle of the page. In Nate's case, I find that it's fairly systematic once he gets going, and you find a kind of a weave going down the page, you know.
But in Olson's case, you know, he makes such a big deal out of the unit of white space as a unit of the measure of breath, and that the page is like a sort of musical score that you can read from, whereas Mackey, when he reads, doesn't pause at all. He just reads it as if it were prose, basically, which is a really alarming experience when he came and read here, having only read his books in private. And had a lot of difficulty knowing.
No, I find him a very non-dynamic reader, Mackey. Olson is a more interesting reader, I think, though unfortunately most of the recordings we have of Olson reading are after he's been drinking a lot. and these, unfortunately, are constantly put forth in films and presentations of Olson, in which he's alone and lonely and drinking, and somebody's come to visit him at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they have a tape recorder. So Olson reads to them. Well, I think that sound is interesting because as a poem noses its way along after line 1 and it was just looking for line 2, I think there is a way in which sound and meaning converge to act as a kind of bait or lead, which enables one to find the word that one wants to use next, right? And sometimes it has more to do with sound, and sometimes more to do with what seems to be the meaning. And my willingness to do this and to contradict myself probably comes more from my work on Cesar Vallejo than reading any American poet. Because Vallejo's willingness to contradict himself and to create really impossible situations of meaning in poems, especially in the Poemas Humanos, the human poems, which I translated when I was quite young in Kyoto, 1962, 63, 64, taught me that one had to be willing to contradict and to see the contradiction as a form of writing, and not simply straighten the poem out so that everything made sense, as they say, you know, in literalistic thinking. So that's in there too.
Great. Okay, stepping back a bit. I don't know if you're going to like this question. What was the first poem you ever wrote, and what were the circumstances?
I was 2 years old, and I was on the verge of my first sentence. And my father was keeping a, quote, baby book, which he kept meticulously for the first 3 years of my life, and then lost all interest in my intellectual achievement. And in the baby book, he has all of the words that I used from the beginning of making words up through my first sentence.
Ah.
And my first sentence, which he claims took place at 2, is, "Boke old mama, take a new mama." And I think of that as my first poem. Which proves that you can get there in mommy-daddy language. You don't need hard frame, right?
Okay, great. Can you talk about translation? Just talk about translation.
Well, my attempts as a translator, beginning with Vallejo, has been to do accurate translations that also have a personality, a tonal personality in English, and also have a certain kind of performance value, have a performance quality. And these are not necessarily compatible, though at times they all come together. I feel that this is a kind of a traditional view of translation, which is completely sneered at by people who like to do homophonic translations. Mm-hmm. For example, there is a young scholar poet in the East named James Wagner who has done a homophonic translation of Vallejo's Trilce.
Can you explain what homophonic is?
It means that you hear a word in Spanish, like you hear amigo, which means friend, and you sound it in English, like am, ego. And you write down a translation of amigo as am space ego. Okay. Now, there have been a few homophonic, and you translate by sound rather than meaning. Meaning would be friend, amigo, right? Now, one of the first projects that got this activity going, though it's probably European, I'm not quite sure.
Was it Bernadette Mayer did this in the St. Mark's Poetry Festival?
Louis Zukowski did a homophonic translation of Catullus, in which he had his wife Celia read Catullus to him, and he listened and wrote down what he heard in English. Now, Zukowski, I don't know whether many of you have read him or not, but at his best, he's a master of the English language. He's really good. And so he's able to make very interesting poems out of the Catullus, which of course have nothing to do with Catullus. And Robert Kelly, who's also a master of language, has done some very interesting homophonic translations of Paul Celan. But these are dependent upon the ability of the poet to render something of their own off of another poet.
They aren't actually
So the Wagner Trilce, which he sent me, and I just read it and I thought it was absolutely gobbledygook. And there are people who have reviewed this man's homophonic translation of Trilce and have said things like, this is exactly what Vallejo should sound like in English. I don't know what that means. You know? What does this mean? So anyway, then there's another kind of translation that I've fought against, in which the translator simply takes liberties and sort of improvises upon the original. A person who's famous for doing that is the translator Ben Bellett, who is dead now. He taught at Bennington College for many years, and for a period of about 30 years he was the Pablo Neruda translator. And there must be a half a dozen collections of his translations of Neruda published by Grove Press. As an example of what Bellett does, in a little ode by Neruda, it's not a very interesting poem, but I can use it as an example. A bug is climbing up a stem, and Neruda says that the bug has piernas metales. Now, anybody who's had Spanish 101 knows that means metal legs. Bellett translates it as wearing ironclad trousers. I mean, it's as if he's on LSD. Listen to that. Pianist Metales becomes, metal legs, becomes wearing ironclad trousers. I mean, it's like a caricature of the Neruda. So, you know, an innocent reader is reading this, and he confronts the ironclad trousers. So I'm against that. I'm against that. So I, as I say, I mentioned the three things that I try to bring together in the translations to honor the original poet's work.
It seems, can I just say something about the homophonic?
Yeah.
It seems like it's a completely different project than actually translating the poet's work. It seems like it's a poem generator, like it's a poem generating machine. It's procedural poetics.
Yes, I agree with you, but the curious thing of it is you have a kind of non-poem. You have a poem that doesn't really belong to you because it's been generated off of somebody else's poem, but it no longer belongs to the original poet.
Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, it's like in purgatory.
That's right.
The weird thing is retaining the source as a kind of authority. I mean, saying like this is, if you just did that and didn't say, oh well, these are homophonic translations of Vallejo, you might have a better chance of making them into your own thing. But if you retain Vallejo as a kind of source.
Oh yes, this is presented as a translation of Vallejo's.
I mean, that for my buck is where the problem is. Because
presented as the homophonic translations, is it ever presented as, well, because we're strictly, just I guess transcribing sounds, that we do honor them in this way because we preserve something, we at least preserve, and it's music, I guess. I don't know. I mean, do they ever, do people who perform homophonic translations ever sort of, justify or legitimize their...
I've never talked to any of these people. You might Google James Wagner Trilce Vallejo and see what he has to say about his translation, or you might want to read a review or two. Another interesting book in this context is the Robert Lowell Imitations, which came out in 1962 and was reviewed as a new collection of poems by Robert Lowell. And it's Lowell's translations of about a dozen European poets from maybe 3 or 4 languages, including Rimbaud and Rilke. And in this case, Lowell rhymes the poems to match the rhymes in the original language, and by rhyming in English, he severely distorts the meaning. This is the problem of translating a sonnet. I mean, it's an absolute trap for the translator, right? And I faced it in translating Vallejo's first collection of poetry, Los Heraldos Negros, much of which is quatrain rhymed poetry. And I had to translate it as free verse. I didn't want to distort it. So my translation lacks the musicality, as it were, of the Spanish, but at least I think I'm saying in English what Vallejo is saying, meaning-wise, in Spanish.
Returning to what you said earlier, how your primary concern is the meaning, preserving meaning.
Accuracy, yeah.
But as well, performance value. I was really curious about what that means.
Well, it means that if I have a choice with a word that more or less, if I have 2 words that will adequately translate a word in Spanish, then I'm looking at the word I use in English that maybe has the most interesting sound value or fits the most cogently within the line itself. In other words, I'm translating word by word, but at the same time I'm looking at the lines and how do the lines voice themselves and sound themselves out loud, right? Because I want to be able to read that Vallejo poem to you, let's say, and you not hear what would be thought of as a literalistic version, I want you to hear the poem as an interesting poem in English. At the same time, I want to be accurate.
Yeah.
No, from James Wagner's viewpoint, I would be thought of as a militantly literalistic translator.
Great. Can you talk about frustration and maybe a time when you've experienced a failure of language in trying to write about something?
Well, this really is back to being a young poet. I mean, I think unless one is extremely fortunate and unusual, such as Rimbaud or people or Dylan Thomas, who burst into poetry and write quite original poetry after having only written poetry for 4 or 5 years. Most of us, it takes 15 to 25 years to generate something that we feel is our own. And so frustration is a huge thing as a young writer. I mean, I went to Kyoto, Japan, after I graduated from Indiana University with my master's degree. The temptation was to go to Greenwich Village and live in New York City and, hang out with Paul Blackburn and Robert Kelly and Jerry Rothenberg and so on. But instead, I took a job with the University of Maryland, taught for 1 year, and then Gary Snyder, on his way to India, came through Tokyo and said, "You don't have to do this. You can teach English as a second language and you can live in Kyoto." So we moved to Kyoto. And so suddenly I found myself writing poetry, sitting on tatami with my little desk. I had all day, 5 days a week, to face myself. And it was terrible. It was terrible because I didn't know. I would write a line, I would type, and I had an old little typewriter on my desk. I would type out a line and I'd look at it and it would strike me as stupid. And then I wouldn't know how to revise it or what to do with it. And I would just sit there and stare at it, often for a couple of hours.
Yeah.
There's a poem called The Churunga that opens Anticline, in which there's a section with this frustration in that particular. Yeah, I would sit there and all I could, at a certain point, I would have to shit. And so I'd get up from the floor and go in and into the binjo, and we had a Japanese toilet. It's a squat toilet, nothing to sit on. And I was also studying the Aztecs at this point, and I saw an image of an Aztec goddess called Tlatziohtl Ixcuina, who's curiously a goddess of childbirth and filth. And there she is squatting as I squat, but there's a little god coming out between her thighs. So she's at least giving birth.
Excellent.
So did that inspire then to go create?
That reminds me of
Yes, in a curious way it did. I mean, the Aztec stone sculpture is so powerful. I mean, it's one of the great bodies of sculpture in the world. Have you seen Coatlicue? The mother goddess of the serpent. Her head is 2 rattlesnakes that come out of a pillar and face each other, and so you're looking at her face, which is an eye of a rattlesnake here and an eye of a rattlesnake there. It's really fantastic. But it was inspiring, and it made me feel in a curious way that I was in a more complicated and complex situation than I would have been otherwise without having that kind of parody of myself, with the goddess.
What advice would you give to high school students who want to write poetry?
That's a tough one, because I think to write poetry you have to make a crucial choice fairly early in your career. And for high school students, they're really so young and they have so little experience with their life that it's much harder to make this decision that I'm going to describe than it would be when you're in your 20s. I think you have to decide what you want to read and what you have to read to do what you want to do. And to some extent, this is a shot in the dark, because you're deciding what you must read before you've read it. I started to write poetry when I was in my early 20s. I'd never read poetry before. And I suddenly realized, you're facing the library and you realize that in your lifetime, if you're lucky, you might read 0.001% of the material that's there. So what are you going to read that's going to help you with your art? I immediately eliminated fiction. I stopped reading fiction when I was about 23 or 24 years old. Thankfully, I'd read some Kafka and Lawrence and Joyce up to that point, so I had some sense of early 20th century international fiction. But I've never read American fiction since that point. I also eliminate detective stories, novels and stuff like that. Entertainment reading. And then, as I began to narrow it down, I got it down to about a dozen American poets. And I did this simply through leafing through anthologies and sipping here and sipping there, and decided there was X number of poets that I really had to read to understand what had taken place earlier in the century. And so I studied those. And I also studied Blake. I read all of Blake while I was in Kyoto. And Blake, to me, is probably the great mountain in English and American literature to climb. I mean, Blake's late writings, the prophetic books, are still absolute concrete to go against. And I think they're stupendous in that sense, that they've maintained their own integrity and imagination for this long.
Can you name some of the 12 books that you...
Well, as I began to write poetry, I discovered Origin magazine. This is a magazine edited by Sid Corman for a number of years, and actually he did 5 series of Origin, but he was still in series 1 when I was at Indiana University in 1957-58. And so Corman's Origin, which featured Charles Olson in the first issue and Robert Creeley in the second issue, sort of immediately became an alternative to Louis Untermeyer anthologies of conventional conservative American poetry, which was what was taught in 20th century literature courses at this time. Right? So I began to sort of follow Origin, and I got in correspondence with Sid Corman. And I had a long correspondence with this useful and very difficult man. And so that began to orient me to an alternative poetry, which of course came full blossom in 1961 with the New American Poetry published by Grove, edited by Don Allen. And that was really a blast of fresh air into writing and gave a whole panoramic view of an alternative poetry. I also began to read Muriel Rukeyser, who I think is a very important writer, and she's not nearly as attended as she might be. Adrienne Rich and I became friends in the late 60s, and we have had a long, long correspondence. I think Adrienne Rich is a very important poetry. I met Gary Snyder in the East. I think Gary is also a wonderful poet and a figure in literature. I mean, Snyder is the kind of person who should have received the Nobel Prize in Literature for what he represents, I think, as a writer, thinker, Buddhist, etc., etc., etc. Of my own generation, I've probably been closer to Robert Kelly than any other poet. I think he's another great, under-attended American writer. Jerry Rothenberg, who's coming here next week. I hope you all come and hear Jerry. And translation. You see, I probably spent more time reading poetry, foreign poetry, and working on it and bringing it into English than I have reading American poetry. Hart Crane was also extremely important to me, and I think some of the best poems of the 20th century, not many, but a handful, have been written by Hart Crane. And in my collection of essays, Archaic Design, I do a kind of 6-page gloss on my candidate for the most interesting lyric poem of the 20th century in American literature, which is Hart Crane's Lacrimae Christi. It's a magnificent piece of writing. And also, you know, Hart Crane's a Midwesterner like I am. I mean, he's from Ohio, I'm from Indiana. And so there's a kind of collegial feeling for poor Hart Crane, you know, who went off the Orizaba at 31 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some of the people that immediately come to mind.
Thank you.
H.D. also. And also I would mention Robert Duncan, and in this context, Robert Duncan's The H.D. book has recently been published by the University of California Press. This is a kind of daybook journal, poetic philosophical meditation based on the work of H.D., 650 pages long. It was written in the late 50s and early 60s, and through mistaken editing on the part of Duncan's estate. You know, Robert Duncan died in 1988, and this manuscript was on his executor's desk in 1989, but it just came out. Anyway, it's out now, and I strongly recommend it to you as a work which would really take you into a very capable poet's meditation on the art of poetry. His letters with Denise Levertov are also very interesting. He and Levertov had a long correspondence which blew up over the Vietnamese War. And Duncan, who strikes me as a more intelligent writer than Denise Levertov, unfortunately suddenly began to treat Levertov terribly. And he destroyed the friendship. And he accused her of things that he had no right to accuse her of. And it's a very interesting, it's a long correspondence. I mean, and the best parts of it are extremely collegial and full of wonderful information and thoughts about this and that. But then it all suddenly goes up in flames.
Okay. This is...
I'm giving you too long answers.
No, this is wonderful. I have a couple more questions. They're kind of big questions.
Oh boy.
So, I would love it if you could respond to these famous lines. The Adorno, to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric, and then Rothenberg, after Auschwitz there is only poetry. Is there? And I guess my question is there anything that poetry can't approach? I know you're involved in these comments, so with Jerry anyway.
Yeah, I quoted it in a piece of mine. I think the Adorno is very understandable when it was said. I think that it's less cogent today than it was at the end of the catastrophic Second World War. Jerry's take on it is an interesting kind of reversal and is said in the context of his single most important book called Kurbin. I'm probably mispronouncing it. K-H-U-R-B-N, which means, I think, in Yiddish catastrophe, and refers to the Shoah, or the Holocaust. And it's a collection of poems that came out in the late 80s, and it was occasioned by Jerry's trip to Europe to the concentration and death camp sites where a number of his European relatives died during the Second World War. And so you have Jerry Rothenberg wandering around the ruins of Auschwitz and Birkenau, etc., meditating and thinking about the world. And so it's in the context of writing these poems that Jerry somehow wants to put something up against Adorno to sort of, in a sense, justify what he's doing. You know? I hope that he reads some of these poems when he comes here. I'm going to be in London next week. I won't be here, alas, to hear and be with Jerry. So the original question is there anything that poetry can't deal with? I think on an individual basis one has to temper the question with how much can any poet know? In other words, I know nothing about physics or advanced mathematics, or I know very little about, let's say, European history. There's whole areas that I simply have no information at hand on. I think I have to stay away from those. I don't think that I can take positions and sort of act as if I know something that I don't know. So in that sense, writing poetry involves a certain amount of research, and in my case that research has involved archaeology, depth psychology, and art. And so you'll find many of my poems percolate in these areas, and these are areas that I can say that I have a certain amount of research and understanding and maybe some expertise in them. So I think one is always at the mercy of one's means, you know, and if you decide to spend several years studying nuclear physics, why then maybe you can write some interesting poems making use of that. But if you don't, then you can't.
Great. Another big question. What is the future of poetry? Sorry.
Well, poetry is going to hell. Meaning it's always on its way to the underworld. The future of poetry is always, I think, translating the subconscious into the conscious. I think the richness of the human psyche is always the ground. It's the compost ghost, as it were, much of which is not personal. It's transpersonal in a Jungian sense. And so one of the things that we're doing as we're sitting there and looking where that line 1 is going to line 2 and line 3 is a sort of encouraging material to come up that seems initially quite irrational. In other words, when I feel that I'm on, it's as if I'm dreaming awake. I'm someplace between a rational mind and literally being asleep. And so there's a kind of a bicameral activity or an antiphonal swing between inducting subconscious. I don't think you can say unconscious, because unconscious means that it's not available. But if it becomes subconscious, then I think it is available to consciousness. And so this is coming up and mixing and allowing you a range of mind that is larger than simply observation or memory. I think memory is probably one of the great enemies of poetry, though it's not as big an enemy as entertainment and education. They're the two worst, entertainment and education. And of course they're rampant in the universities now. What was the question again?
What is the future of poetry?
Well, we don't have an audience. Maybe Seamus Heaney has an audience, but he would be one of the few serious poets in the world. I mean, Billy Collins' audience doesn't mean anything to me because I think Billy Collins is a jerk. But Seamus Heaney is a serious, talented Irish poet, and he apparently sells something like 65% of the poetry collections that are sold in the British Isles. Okay, so he has an audience. If you don't have an audience, you're sort of in deep shit, because you're really writing by yourself, for yourself, and maybe with a little community of writers.